It was a crisp autumn morning, and the college campus hummed with its usual energy. The air was alive with the rustling of fallen leaves and the rhythmic thud of footsteps as students hurried to their classes. Laughter and fragments of conversation echoed against the old brick buildings, giving the campus an aura of youthful vigor. Among the crowd, backpacks slung over shoulders and phones in hand, stood Professor Claire Hammond. Claire wasn't one to draw attention. She dressed in simple, practical clothing: cardigans, slacks, and sensible shoes. Her dark hair was often tied back in a neat bun, and her glasses perched firmly on her nose gave her an air of quiet authority. Her students admired her for her patience and her clear, thoughtful explanations in the classroom. But to most, Claire was simply part of the background, a constant presence but never a standout. She seemed the type to lead an ordinary, predictable life. What they didn't know was that Claire's life was anything but ordinary. Every day, she arrived on campus in her dependable old sedan, a car that had seen better days but ran faithfully. Its dull silver paint had faded, and a small dent on the rear bumper hinted at a history of bumps and scrapes. Yet, Claire loved that car. It wasn't flashy, but it was hers, a symbol of her straightforward, no-nonsense approach to life. Claire's routine was comforting in its regularity. She parked in the same spot in the faculty lot every morning, greeted her colleagues with a polite nod, and carried her leather satchel into the lecture hall where she taught literature. She was the type of professor who rarely raised her voice, instead captivating her students with her passion for words and stories. To them, she was dependable, perhaps even predictable, and certainly kind. But beneath Claire's calm exterior was a story few could have imagined. Claire's life had a quiet strength woven into its fabric, a strength that came not only from her own resilience but also from the man who stood by her side. Her husband, Jack Hammond, was nothing like the reserved professor. A retired Marine, Jack had seen the kind of action that hardened men and tested their limits. He had served his country with honor, leading missions that demanded both courage and precision. His body bore the scars of his service, but his spirit remained unbroken. Jack had a presence that was hard to ignore. His towering frame, broad shoulders, and steady gaze made it clear that he was a man who didn't shy away from challenges. Yet, in the quiet suburban home he shared with Claire, he was the picture of peace and contentment. Jack had traded the battlefield for a life of gardening, tinkering in the garage, and enjoying long evenings with his wife. He rarely spoke of his time in the Marines, preferring instead to focus on the present. But life has a way of disrupting even the most peaceful of routines. That morning, as Claire walked toward her office, her thoughts were filled with the day's agenda. She was reviewing lecture notes in her head, preparing for an afternoon discussion on classic American novels. It was a normal day, or so she thought. Yet, the universe had other plans. The first sign of trouble came when she glanced at her car during a brief coffee break. A group of motorcycles had appeared in the lot, parked haphazardly near the faculty vehicles. They were large, gleaming machines, their chrome accents catching the sunlight. The riders, dressed in leather jackets and heavy boots, lounged nearby, laughing and exchanging crude jokes. They didn't seem like students, and their presence was unusual enough to make Claire pause. At first, she brushed it off. Perhaps they were visiting someone on campus or passing through town. But something about their loud, boisterous behavior made her uneasy. One of them leaned against a shiny black bike, his arms crossed as he surveyed the lot with a smug grin. Another kicked at a patch of gravel, sending stones skittering across the pavement. They didn't belong here, and they didn't seem to care who noticed. Claire returned to her office, trying to push the scene out of her mind. She had papers to grade and a lecture to prepare. Yet, a nagging feeling persisted, a sense that something wasn't right. Her instincts told her to stay alert, though she couldn't have predicted just how right they were. When her last class ended, Claire stepped outside, expecting the usual peaceful walk to her car. Instead, she was greeted by a sight that made her heart sink. Her dependable old sedan was surrounded by the bikers, their laughter echoing across the lot. One of them, a man with a thick beard and a cigarette dangling from his lips, was leaning on the hood. Another ran his hand along the car's roof, his expression one of mock admiration. "Whose rust bucket is this?" one of them called out, his voice carrying over the sound of the breeze. The others laughed, a sound that sent a chill down Claire's spine. She froze, unsure of what to do. Confronting them seemed unwise, they were larger, louder, and clearly not in the mood for polite conversation. Her mind raced, thinking of Jack and the stories he had told her of tense moments during his service. She wished, in that moment, for his presence, his calm strength that had a way of making even the most chaotic situations feel manageable. But Jack wasn't there. Claire was on her own. The bikers didn't stop at mockery. One of them pulled out a key and dragged it across the side of her car, the screech of metal against paint cutting through the air like a blade. Another kicked at the front tire, leaving a muddy scuff mark on the silver finish. They treated the car as though it were a toy, a source of amusement for their own entertainment. Claire's hands tightened around the strap of her satchel. She wanted to shout, to demand they stop, but her voice seemed caught in her throat. Instead, she turned away and walked back to the building, her heart pounding. She didn't look back, but she could still hear their laughter, a sound that would haunt her for the rest of the day. When Claire got home that evening, her usual smile was absent. She told Jack everything, every detail of the bikers, their taunts, and the damage to her car. She expected him to be angry, to storm out the door and confront them on the spot. But Jack's reaction was different. His face was calm, his expression unreadable. "Did they touch you?" he asked, his voice steady. "No," Claire replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Good," he said, standing up and heading toward the garage. "Then I'll take care of the rest." Claire watched as Jack disappeared into the garage, the door closing behind him with a soft click. She didn't know what he was planning, but she trusted him completely. Jack wasn't the type to act impulsively. Whatever he had in mind, she knew it would be calculated and effective. What Claire didn't realize was that Jack's peaceful life was about to collide with his past in a way neither of them could have anticipated. The bikers had awakened something in him, a side of Jack that he had long kept hidden. And by the time they crossed paths again, they would learn that Claire Hammond's husband was anything but ordinary. It was as if a storm was brewing, but only Jack could sense it. Claire had retreated to the kitchen, hoping to distract herself by preparing dinner, but her mind kept drifting back to the scene in the parking lot. She chopped vegetables absent-mindedly, her hands trembling slightly as the images replayed in her mind: the mocking laughter, the screech of metal, the way they had treated her car like a joke. In the garage, Jack moved with quiet efficiency. The door was shut, and from the window, Claire could see the faint glow of the overhead light. She could hear him rummaging through his tools, the occasional clink of metal breaking the stillness. Jack wasn't a man of many words, but when he acted, it was always with purpose. For years, Jack had lived a life of routine and tranquility. His days of tactical maneuvers and high-stakes missions felt like a distant memory. He had built a peaceful existence with Claire, trading battlefields for backyards, and uniforms for flannel shirts. But that night, as he sorted through his tools and made a few quiet phone calls, something from his past stirred awake. "Jack," Claire called softly, standing in the doorway of the garage. She held a steaming mug of tea, her expression a mixture of worry and curiosity. "Are you planning something?" Jack looked up from his workbench, his gaze steady but kind. "I'm just making a few preparations," he said simply, taking the mug from her hands. He sipped the tea, his eyes meeting hers. "Don't worry, Claire. I won't let anyone disrespect you like that again." The conviction in his voice made Claire feel both comforted and unsettled. She trusted Jack with her life, she always had, but there was an edge to his tone that she hadn't heard in years. It wasn't anger, exactly. It was something deeper, more controlled. A reminder that Jack Hammond was a man who had faced far worse than a gang of bikers and come out stronger. "Just promise me you'll be careful," Claire said, placing a hand on his arm. Jack nodded, a faint smile softening his rugged features. "Always." The next day on campus, Claire went about her routine with a sense of unease. The damage to her car was impossible to ignore. The deep scratch down the driver's side glared at her every time she walked past, a constant reminder of the biker's cruelty. Students and colleagues noticed too, their curious glances and whispered questions only adding to her discomfort. "Dr. Hammond, what happened to your car?" one of her students asked hesitantly after class. "It's nothing," Claire replied with a forced smile. "Just a bit of vandalism. It'll be taken care of." But the truth was, she didn't know how it would be taken care of or when. Jack hadn't given her any details, and she hadn't pressed him. She trusted him, but the uncertainty gnawed at her. The bikers were still on campus. She saw them in the parking lot again, their motorcycles lined up like soldiers in formation. They seemed to be enjoying their little reign of chaos, their laughter carrying across the lot as they loitered near their bikes. One of them, the man with the thick beard and leather vest, glanced in her direction and smirked. It was a look that sent a chill down her spine. Claire hurried to her car, avoiding their gaze. She felt a surge of relief as the engine started, the familiar hum of the old sedan grounding her. As she pulled out of the lot, she couldn't help but glance in her rearview mirror. The bikers were still there, watching, their smug expressions making her grip the wheel tighter. That evening, Jack sat at the kitchen table, a small notebook in front of him. He had been writing in it for hours, jotting down names, locations, and plans with a precision that reminded Claire of the meticulous way he used to prepare for missions. She watched him from across the room, her worry growing with each passing minute. "Jack," she finally said, breaking the silence. "I don't want this to escalate. It's just a car." Jack looked up, his expression calm but resolute. "It's not just about the car, Claire. It's about respect. They crossed a line, and they need to understand that actions have consequences." Claire sighed, sitting down beside him. "I know you want to protect me, and I appreciate that more than I can say. But please, don't put yourself in danger." Jack reached out, taking her hand in his. "I won't," he promised. "But I won't let them get away with it either. Trust me, Claire. I know what I'm doing." The next morning, Jack left the house early. He kissed Claire on the forehead before he went, a gesture that was both comforting and ominous. "I'll be back later," he said, his voice steady. "Where are you going?" Claire asked, her brow furrowed. "Just taking care of a few things," Jack replied. He didn't elaborate, and Claire didn't press him. Jack's first stop was a local biker shop on the outskirts of town. It was the kind of place that smelled like oil and rubber, with racks of helmets and leather jackets lining the walls. The owner, a grizzled man named Pete, recognized Jack immediately. "Jack Hammond," Pete said, leaning against the counter with a grin. "Haven't seen you in years. What brings you here?" Jack explained the situation in his usual no-nonsense way, his voice low but firm. Pete listened intently, nodding along. "Sounds like you've got a real bunch of troublemakers on your hands," he said when Jack finished. "What do you need from me?" Jack leaned in slightly, his gaze unwavering. "Information." Pete nodded again, a glint of understanding in his eyes. "I'll see what I can dig up. In the meantime, you be careful, Jack. These guys might be punks, but they don't like being challenged." "I can handle them," Jack replied. His tone wasn't boastful, it was a simple statement of fact. From there, Jack made a few more stops, each one adding a piece to the puzzle. He spoke to old friends, men who had served with him in the Marines and now lived quiet lives like his own. They shared stories, advice, and offers of support. By the time Jack returned home that evening, he had a plan. On campus, the bikers were becoming bolder. They loitered near the faculty lot almost daily, their presence a source of tension for everyone. Claire avoided them as much as possible, but she couldn't ignore the way they seemed to enjoy making people uncomfortable. One afternoon, as she walked to her car, she found a note tucked under the windshield wiper. It was scrawled on a scrap of paper, the handwriting messy but legible, "Stay out of our way." Claire's heart raced as she read the note, her hands trembling. She glanced around the lot, but the bikers were nowhere in sight. She crumpled the paper and stuffed it into her bag, her mind racing. That night, she showed the note to Jack. He read it carefully, his expression unreadable. "They're trying to intimidate you," he said finally. "But don't worry, Claire. This ends soon." "How?" Claire asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack didn't answer directly. Instead, he placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip reassuring. "Trust me," he said again. The next morning, the bikers arrived on campus as usual, their motorcycles roaring into the lot like a pack of wolves. But this time, something was different. As they parked their bikes and began their usual routine of loud jokes and casual intimidation, they noticed a figure standing at the edge of the lot. It was Jack Hammond, his arms crossed and his stance steady. He wore a leather jacket and jeans, his presence commanding attention. The bikers exchanged glances, their laughter fading as they sized him up. Jack didn't move. He simply stood there, watching them with an intensity that made even the boldest among them feel a twinge of unease. "Who's this guy?" one of the bikers muttered, his voice low. "I don't know," another replied. "But he doesn't look like someone to mess with." And for the first time, the bikers began to feel that maybe they had underestimated their target. The biker gang rolled into town like a storm, their engines growling with a ferocity that turned heads. It was the kind of sound that demanded attention, vibrating through the air and unsettling anyone within earshot. These men weren't locals, and their presence felt like an intrusion. They wore leather jackets adorned with patches, tattoos curling up their arms and necks, and a swagger that exuded arrogance. Their laughter was loud, their movements deliberate, and their disregard for others palpable. When they parked their hulking motorcycles in the campus lot, it was as though they were staking a claim. Each bike gleamed under the midday sun, polished chrome catching the light like a predator's teeth. They didn't take one or two spaces, they took over the lot, lining up their bikes haphazardly and leaving little room for anyone else. Claire Hammond noticed them immediately. It was hard not to. They were a stark contrast to the students who hurried between classes, their presence as loud as the growl of their engines. Claire wasn't one to judge people based on their appearances, her years as a professor had taught her the value of looking deeper. But this group was different. It wasn't just their rough exteriors, it was the way they acted, as if rules didn't apply to them. From her vantage point near the faculty building, Claire tried to go about her day. She told herself they were just passing through, a temporary distraction in her otherwise quiet routine. But her sense of unease grew when she saw them gathering near the faculty lot. At first, it was harmless, or so it seemed. The men lounged around their bikes, laughing and talking loudly, their voices carrying across the lot. But then, they began to move. One of them, a tall man with a beard as thick as a bramble bush, spotted Claire's old sedan. "Look at this piece of junk," he said, his voice loud enough to echo. He motioned to the car with a mocking grin. "Who drives this tin can? Did they pick it up from a scrapyard?" The others laughed, their amusement sharp and cruel. One of them, a wiry man with tattoos that crept up his neck like vines, pulled out a key. He approached the car with deliberate slowness, the grin on his face widening as he dragged the key along the side of the sedan. The screech of metal on metal made Claire flinch. From where she stood, she could see the deep scratch the man left behind, a jagged line that ran the length of the car. Her car. Claire gripped her satchel tightly, her knuckles white. Her first instinct was to march over and demand they stop. But as she took a hesitant step forward, doubt crept in. There were 5 of them, each one larger and more imposing than the last. Confronting them alone would be reckless. "Hey, check this out," another biker called out, kicking the car's front tire. The impact left a dusty scuff mark on the silver finish, and the group erupted into more laughter. Claire's stomach churned. She felt helpless, frozen in place as they continued their taunts. Each scrape, each kick, felt personal, a direct challenge to her, even though she wasn't sure they knew she was watching. One of them leaned against the hood, his arms crossed as he surveyed the car with a sneer. "You think whoever owns this thing even cares," he said, spitting on the ground. That was the final straw. Claire turned on her heel and headed back into the building, her heart pounding. She couldn't stay there and watch them vandalize her car any longer. Inside, her mind raced. She felt torn between anger and fear, frustration and resignation. She didn't know what to do. Calling security seemed pointless, the campus guards were few and ill-equipped to handle a group like this. And confronting them herself? That felt like walking into a lion's den. Claire paced her office, her thoughts circling like vultures. She wished Jack were there. Jack would know what to do. The bikers' presence wasn't a one-time event. Over the next few days, they became a fixture in the faculty lot, their motorcycles always parked in the same chaotic formation. Their behavior escalated, to louder taunts, more aggressive actions, and a growing sense of entitlement to the space. Other faculty members noticed, though few dared to say anything. Some avoided the lot altogether, parking elsewhere to steer clear of the bikers. Those who had to park nearby hurried to and from their cars, heads down, hoping to avoid drawing attention. But Claire couldn't avoid them forever. Each time she saw the scratch on her car or the muddy scuff marks, anger bubbled in her chest. It wasn't just about the damage, it was the principle. They had no right to behave this way, to intimidate and disrupt with impunity. One morning, as Claire approached her car, she found something new. A piece of paper was tucked under the windshield wiper. She pulled it free, her brow furrowing as she read the hastily scrawled message. "Nice car. Bet you're proud of it. Watch yourself." Her hands trembled as she crumpled the note. She glanced around the lot, but the bikers weren't there. Still, the message was clear. It was a warning, a reminder that they were watching. That evening, Claire sat at the kitchen table, the crumpled note in front of her. She had told herself she wouldn't involve Jack, that she could handle this on her own. But as she looked at the words on the paper, a mix of anger and fear churned in her chest. When Jack walked in, she didn't hesitate. "We need to talk," she said, her voice firmer than she expected. Jack listened as she explained everything: the bikers, the vandalism, the note. His expression remained calm, but Claire knew him well enough to see the flicker of tension in his jaw. "They've been doing this for days?" he asked, his voice low. Claire nodded. "I didn't want to bother you with it, but I don't know what to do." Jack reached for the note, smoothing it out on the table. He studied it for a moment before looking up at Claire. "You did the right thing telling me," he said. His tone was measured, but there was a steely resolve beneath it. "What are you going to do?" Claire asked, her heart pounding. Jack's gaze didn't waver. "What needs to be done?" The next day, Jack accompanied Claire to campus. He didn't make a show of it. He stayed in the background, observing from a distance as Claire went about her routine. He saw the way her shoulders tensed when they passed the faculty lot, the way her eyes darted toward the bikers who lounged by their motorcycles like kings surveying their domain. Jack didn't approach them, not yet. Instead, he took note of everything: their faces, their body language, their behavior. He wasn't a man to rush into things. Years of military training had taught him the value of patience, of planning. That afternoon, as Claire taught her class, Jack made a few phone calls. He spoke to old friends, men he trusted implicitly, men who understood what it meant to handle problems quietly and effectively. By the time Claire's lecture ended, Jack was waiting for her outside the building. He didn't say much, but the look in his eyes told her that he had a plan. "Let's go home," he said simply. Claire didn't press him for details. She trusted Jack with her life, and she knew that whatever he was planning, it would be calculated and decisive. The tension on campus only grew in the following days. The bikers showed no signs of leaving, their presence a constant source of unease. Claire avoided them as much as possible, but it was hard to ignore their taunts, their laughter, their sheer audacity. And then, one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jack Hammond decided it was time to act. Jack Hammond wasn't a man who rushed into conflict, but he wasn't one to let things slide, either. His time in the Marines had taught him the importance of assessing a situation thoroughly before making a move. He knew the bikers were trouble, but he also knew they were cocky, too confident to see what might be coming. For the next few days, Jack remained a quiet presence on campus. While Claire taught her classes, he observed from the periphery. His calm demeanor masked the storm brewing inside him. Jack had spent years dealing with adversaries far more dangerous than a gang of overgrown bullies. He wasn't worried about himself. His concern was for Claire. The bikers had no idea who Jack was. To them, he was just another face blending into the background. But Jack noticed everything: the way the leader strutted with an air of authority, the way the others followed his lead without question, and the way they used intimidation as their primary weapon. One evening, Jack parked his truck near the edge of the lot, far from their motorcycles but within earshot. He listened to their conversations, casually leaning against the hood of his vehicle. Their words confirmed what he suspected: they weren't just aimless troublemakers. They had a system, a hierarchy, and a long list of petty crimes that they bragged about like trophies. "They won't do anything," one of the bikers said, his voice dripping with confidence. "These college types are all the same, scared of their own shadows." Jack smirked to himself. It was a fatal flaw, underestimating people based on appearances. The following day, Claire found a new note on her windshield. This one was shorter, cruder. "We don't like snitches. Don't make us come find you." Claire's hands trembled as she read it, but this time, she didn't feel helpless. She folded the note carefully and slipped it into her pocket. That evening, she handed it to Jack. "They're escalating," she said quietly, her voice tinged with worry. Jack took the note, his expression unreadable. He didn't respond immediately, but Claire could see the tension in his jaw. "They've made their move," he said finally, his voice calm but firm. "Now it's my turn." Jack's first step was to make a call to an old friend, Marcus, a former Marine who now worked in private security. Marcus was the kind of man who thrived on solving problems, and he owed Jack more than one favor. "Need some intel," Jack said when Marcus picked up. "Got a group of bikers causing trouble. Think you can help?" Marcus didn't hesitate. "Send me what you've got. I'll dig around." By the next morning, Marcus had a full report. The bikers were part of a loosely organized gang known for moving from town to town, causing chaos wherever they went. They'd been linked to vandalism, theft, and a few violent altercations, but they were careful not to stay in one place long enough to face real consequences. "They're small time," Marcus said. "But they think they're untouchable. That's their weak spot." Jack listened carefully, a plan already forming in his mind. He thanked Marcus and hung up, then began preparing. That evening, Jack drove to the faculty lot after sunset. The bikers had left for the day, their motorcycles gone, but their arrogance lingered in the form of beer cans and cigarette butts scattered across the pavement. Jack walked the length of the lot, his boots crunching against the debris, his mind focused. The next step in his plan was subtle but crucial. Jack wasn't looking for a physical confrontation, not yet. Instead, he wanted to send a message, one they couldn't ignore. The following morning, the bikers arrived to find their motorcycles neatly rearranged in a single line at the edge of the lot, far from their usual chaotic formation. Each bike was untouched but meticulously aligned, as if placed there with care. "What the hell?" the leader growled, his eyes narrowing as he surveyed the scene. The others muttered in confusion, their bravado shaken. They didn't know who had moved the bikes, but the message was clear: someone was watching them. Jack, standing near the faculty building, watched their reaction from a distance. He didn't smile, but there was a glint of satisfaction in his eyes. It was a small victory, but it was enough to sow doubt in their minds. The bikers' leader, a man named Vince, wasn't the type to let things slide. That afternoon, he gathered his crew near the lot, their voices low and serious. "Whoever's messing with us, they're gonna pay," Vince said, his tone deadly. "We don't get disrespected." They began scouring the campus for clues, asking questions, and watching the faculty and students with renewed intensity. But no one gave them the answers they wanted. Jack kept a low profile, observing from the shadows. He knew it was only a matter of time before they made another move, and he was ready for it. The bikers' retaliation came 2 days later. They arrived at the campus early, their engines roaring louder than ever. This time, they didn't stop at vandalizing cars. They began intimidating students directly, blocking pathways and demanding answers about who had moved their bikes. Claire watched from her office window, her heart pounding. She could see the fear on the students' faces, the way they avoided the bikers' gaze. It was unbearable. Jack, however, was prepared. He had anticipated their escalation and had already contacted campus security, providing them with Marcus's report on the gang. When the bikers crossed the line, security was ready to intervene. 2 guards approached the group, their postures firm but non-threatening. "You can't be here," one of them said, his voice steady. "This is private property, and your actions are disruptive." Vince sneered, stepping forward. "Who's gonna make us leave?" "You." Before the situation could escalate further, Jack appeared. He walked toward the group with a calm, deliberate stride, his presence commanding attention. "You've had your fun," he said, his voice steady but cold. "But it ends here." Vince turned to him, his sneer faltering. "And who are you supposed to be?" Jack didn't answer immediately. He let the silence hang for a moment, his eyes locked on Vince. Then he said, "Someone who doesn't tolerate bullies." The tension in the air was palpable. The bikers exchanged uncertain glances, their earlier bravado waning. Jack's calm demeanor was more unsettling than any shout or threat. "This isn't over," Vince said finally, his voice dripping with false confidence. Jack tilted his head slightly, his gaze unwavering. "We'll see about that." As the bikers retreated, muttering under their breath, Jack turned to the security guards. "Keep an eye on them," he said. "They're not done yet." Claire approached him, her expression a mix of relief and worry. "What happens now?" she asked. Jack placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Now, we make sure they understand what real consequences look like." The next morning, Claire awoke to find Jack already gone. He'd left early, leaving only a note on the kitchen counter. "Stay calm. Trust me." Claire wasn't sure what he was planning, but she trusted Jack. She had to. When she arrived at the campus, everything seemed normal at first. Students bustled through the halls, the hum of lectures drifted through open windows, and the autumn leaves continued their lazy descent onto the ground. But as she neared the faculty parking lot, her steps slowed. The bikers were back. Their motorcycles were lined up like a makeshift barricade, blocking several parking spaces. The gang lounged nearby, their leather jackets gleaming in the morning sun, their laughter cutting through the air like knives. Claire's car, still bearing the scars of their vandalism, sat on the far end of the lot, ignored for now but vulnerable. One of them, Vince, the apparent leader, leaned against his bike, a cigarette dangling from his lips. His eyes scanned the lot like a predator looking for prey. Claire forced herself to walk past them without faltering, though her heart pounded. She felt their eyes on her, their snickers a cruel backdrop to her measured steps. But as she neared the building, she noticed something strange. Jack's truck was parked at the far end of the lot, partially obscured by the shadow of a large oak tree. Her stomach flipped. What was he doing here? Inside, Claire tried to focus on her work, but her mind kept drifting back to the lot. Jack's presence unsettled her, not because she doubted him, but because she knew what he was capable of when pushed. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden commotion outside. The roar of engines, shouts, and laughter filled the air. She rushed to the window, her heart sinking as she saw the bikers revving their motorcycles, forming a noisy spectacle that disrupted the otherwise peaceful campus. Vince seemed to be orchestrating the chaos, barking orders to his crew. They weaved their bikes through the lot, narrowly missing parked cars, their antics clearly designed to intimidate. But then Claire spotted Jack. He stood near his truck, arms crossed, watching the bikers with a calm intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. He didn't move, didn't react, just observed. And that's when it began. The first biker, a burly man with a thick beard, suddenly veered too close to Jack's truck. As his motorcycle roared past, something popped, a sharp, hissing sound that echoed across the lot. The biker skidded to a stop, cursing loudly as his back tire deflated before everyone's eyes. "What the hell?" he shouted, dismounting to inspect the damage. The others slowed, their laughter faltering as they watched their comrade struggle with the flat tire. Then it happened again. Another biker, trying to show off, sped past Jack's truck. This time, it wasn't just a flat tire, his engine sputtered and died, smoke rising ominously from beneath the seat. He jumped off, swearing loudly as his bike refused to start. Vince's eyes narrowed, his confident smirk fading. "What's going on?" he barked. The bikers began checking their motorcycles, one by one. 3 more discovered issues: slashed tires, loose parts, mysterious malfunctions that rendered their bikes useless. Jack remained where he was, silent and still. He didn't even glance their way. "What did you do?" Vince finally snapped, storming toward Jack. Jack uncrossed his arms, his expression unreadable. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said calmly. "Bull." Vince spat, pointing at the disabled bikes. "This is your doing." Jack tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady. "You sure about that?" The calm in his voice seemed to rattle Vince more than any shouting could have. "You think you're smart, old man?" Vince growled, stepping closer. "You have no idea who you're messing with." Jack didn't flinch. Instead, he took a deliberate step forward, closing the distance between them. Though Vince was taller and bulkier, Jack's presence made him seem small. "I could say the same to you," Jack said quietly, his tone even but charged with an unspoken warning. For a moment, Vince hesitated. He glanced back at his crew, who were still fussing over their disabled bikes, their confidence eroding with every passing second. "You think this scares us?" Vince sneered, though his voice lacked the conviction it had earlier. Jack leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You're not scared yet. But you will be." Claire watched the scene unfold from the faculty building, her hands gripping the window sill. She couldn't hear what was being said, but she could see the tension in every movement, every glance. She had seen this side of Jack before, though rarely. It was the side of him that had survived war zones, that had faced danger head-on and come out the other side unbroken. But the bikers didn't know that. To them, he was just another middle-aged man defending his wife's honor. They had no idea what they were dealing with. The bikers finally retreated, their remaining functional bikes roaring as they left the lot in a cloud of exhaust. Vince shot Jack a venomous glare before following his crew, but he didn't say another word. Jack waited until they were gone before he turned and walked toward the building. Claire met him at the entrance, her expression a mix of relief and apprehension. "What did you do?" she asked softly. Jack gave her a small, reassuring smile. "Just leveled the playing field." Over the next few days, the bikers didn't return. The campus seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief, though whispers about the mysterious incidents in the parking lot continued to circulate. Claire hoped it was over, but Jack wasn't convinced. He knew men like Vince didn't back down easily. They would regroup, recalibrate, and come back stronger. So he prepared. Jack's preparations were subtle but thorough. He installed a small camera near the faculty lot, hidden among the branches of a tree. He reinforced Claire's car with a few minor but effective modifications: a stronger alarm system, reinforced glass, and a tracking device, just in case. He also began spending more time on campus, blending into the background as he observed. He noted the comings and goings of students and faculty, looking for anything out of the ordinary. And then, one evening, he found it. The bikers had returned, but this time, they were careful. They parked their motorcycles on the far side of town and approached the campus on foot, avoiding the parking lot entirely. Vince led the way, his eyes scanning the area like a predator on the hunt. Jack, watching from a distance, smirked to himself. They thought they were being clever, but they were walking into a trap they couldn't see. Jack had spent his life anticipating the unexpected, and the bikers' stealthier approach didn't surprise him. In fact, he welcomed it. Their arrogance had been their greatest weakness, and now, with their subtle shift in strategy, they thought they'd regain the upper hand. Jack knew better. From his vantage point, concealed behind a cluster of trees near the edge of the campus, he watched the bikers move. They stuck to the shadows, keeping low and quiet as they approached the faculty building. Vince was leading the charge, his swagger replaced by a calculated focus. Claire, unaware of the unfolding events, was still inside, finishing up her last lecture of the day. The windows of her classroom glowed softly, the faint silhouettes of students and her moving across the glass. Jack's chest tightened at the thought of her being so close to danger, but he kept his emotions in check. This wasn't the time for fear. It was the time for action. As the bikers drew closer, Jack noted their formation. Vince was flanked by two others, while the rest stayed a few paces behind, keeping watch. They weren't carrying visible weapons, but Jack knew better than to trust appearances. These men weren't here to talk. Jack had anticipated their move and had already set things in motion. He glanced down at the small device in his hand, a remote link to the campus's recently upgraded security system. Thanks to a few calls to Marcus, Jack had gained temporary access to key functions of the system, including the parking lot cameras and alarms. He waited until Vince and his crew were within striking distance of the building's rear entrance. Then he pressed the button. The piercing wail of an alarm shattered the quiet evening, echoing across the campus. Lights near the rear entrance began to strobe, illuminating the bikers in harsh flashes. Startled, they froze, looking around wildly as if trying to find the source of the commotion. "What the hell?" one of them muttered, shielding his eyes from the glaring lights. "Stay calm," Vince hissed, though his own voice betrayed his unease. "It's just a security system." But Jack wasn't done. From his position, he triggered another sequence. This time, a loud, pre-recorded announcement blared through the nearby speakers. "Warning, unauthorized activity detected. Campus security has been alerted." The bikers exchanged uneasy glances. "Let's get out of here," one of them whispered, his voice tinged with panic. "No," Vince snapped, though his bravado was clearly wavering. "We don't run from this." But Jack had anticipated Vince's stubbornness. He knew the leader would try to save face in front of his crew. So, Jack played his next card. Suddenly, the floodlights near the main parking lot snapped on, bathing the area in stark brightness. The bikers turned, squinting as the light illuminated a figure standing in the middle of the lot. It was Jack. He stood calmly, his hands in his pockets, as if he had all the time in the world. The bikers hesitated, unsure of how to react. Vince's eyes narrowed as recognition dawned. "You again," he growled, stepping forward. "You think you're clever, old man?" Jack didn't respond immediately. He let the silence hang, letting Vince's frustration build. Finally, he spoke, his voice steady and low. "I warned you," Jack said simply. "You chose not to listen." Vince laughed, though the sound was forced. "You think this scares us? We've dealt with worse than you." Jack tilted his head slightly, his gaze never wavering. "Is that so?" The calm in his tone sent a ripple of unease through the group. Jack wasn't bluffing, and they knew it. At that moment, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the lot. Campus security had arrived, 2 guards flanking Marcus, who had decided to pay a visit in person. Marcus, a towering figure with a no-nonsense demeanor, walked with purpose, his sharp eyes assessing the situation. Vince turned, his confidence faltering further. "Who the hell are they?" Jack allowed himself a small, almost imperceptible smile. "That's the thing about bullies," he said quietly. "You never know when someone's going to stand up to them." Marcus stopped a few feet away, his arms crossed over his chest. "We've been watching you," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "And we've got enough footage to make your lives very complicated." The bikers glanced at each other, their bravado crumbling. Vince, however, wasn't ready to back down completely. "This ain't over," he spat, his voice shaky but defiant. Jack took a step closer, his presence overwhelming. "It is if you're smart," he said. "You leave this campus. You leave this town. And you don't come back." The silence that followed was deafening. Vince's crew looked to him for guidance, but for once, he seemed at a loss. Finally, with a muttered curse, he gestured for them to retreat. The bikers left on foot, their pride battered and their confidence shattered. Jack and Marcus watched them go, ensuring they didn't linger. As the last of the bikers disappeared into the distance, Marcus turned to Jack. "You handled that well," he said. "But they'll try something else. Guys like that don't know when to quit." Jack nodded. "I know. But they'll think twice before coming back here." Claire emerged from the building then, her face pale but her expression resolute. She walked straight to Jack, her eyes searching his. "Are they gone?" she asked softly. "For now," Jack replied, his voice gentle. Claire let out a shaky breath, relief washing over her. "Thank you," she whispered. Jack placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It's not over yet," he said. "But we're ready for whatever comes next." The lot fell silent as Jack stood over the groaning gang leader. His words echoed, each syllable a warning that sent chills down the spines of the onlookers. The bikers, who had spent the past days acting untouchable, suddenly looked like cornered animals. The leader, Vince, gritted his teeth and tried to push himself up, his bravado cracking but not completely gone. "You think you can scare us? You're just some old..." Jack didn't let him finish. With a single, sharp movement, he crouched down, grabbing Vince by the collar and pulling him closer. His voice was low, but it carried the weight of every battle, every lesson he'd learned in the Marines. "You don't know me," Jack said, his tone as steady as the rumble of his bike. But you're about to learn exactly why that's a problem for you. Behind Jack, his Marine buddies moved into position, forming a silent wall of resolve. Each one carried the same air of authority, their stances unwavering. These weren't just men who rode motorcycles, they were men who had ridden through war zones, who had faced enemies far more dangerous than Vince and his gang. The bikers exchanged nervous glances, their earlier arrogance replaced by uncertainty. The growl of engines in the distance added to their unease. The Marines' bikes still idled, their steady rumble a backdrop that seemed to vibrate through the ground, amplifying the tension. "Let him go," one of Vince's men shouted, trying to muster courage. But even he took a step back when Jack's piercing gaze turned toward him. Jack released Vince abruptly, letting him stumble backward into the arms of one of his crew. "You've got two choices," Jack said, standing tall. "You walk away now, or you see what happens when you pick a fight you can't win." Vince's pride wouldn't let him back down so easily. He stood, brushing himself off, and tried to laugh, though the sound was hollow. "You think you're tough? You don't scare me." Jack smiled faintly, a dangerous glint in his eyes. "You're still talking. That tells me you're either brave or stupid. I'm betting on the second one." With a nod from Jack, one of his Marine buddies stepped forward. The man was massive, his arms crossed over a chest that looked like it could stop a truck. He didn't say a word, he didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to make Vince's men shuffle uncomfortably. "What's it gonna be?" Jack asked, giving Vince one last chance. For a moment, Vince seemed to consider his options. Then, in a move born more of desperation than strategy, he lunged at Jack. It was over in seconds. Jack sidestepped smoothly, his years of training kicking in like muscle memory. He caught Vince mid-lunge, twisting him around and pinning him to the ground in a move so fast it was almost a blur. Vince struggled, but Jack held firm, his strength undeniable. "Bad choice," Jack said quietly. The other bikers froze, torn between helping their leader and saving their own skins. One of them started to step forward, but a sharp command from one of the Marines stopped him in his tracks. "Don't," the Marine said simply, his voice like steel. The biker hesitated, then stepped back, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. Jack let Vince go, standing and dusting his hands off like he'd just taken out the trash. Vince groaned, rolling onto his back, his bravado finally shattered. "Here's what's going to happen," Jack said, his voice carrying across the lot. "You're going to leave this campus. You're going to leave this town. And if I hear that you've bothered anyone here again, I won't be as nice next time." The bikers didn't argue. They scrambled to help Vince to his feet, their earlier swagger completely gone. As the gang limped away, the campus erupted in cheers. Students and faculty who had been watching from a distance began to clap and cheer, their earlier fear replaced with awe and gratitude. Claire, who had watched the entire scene from the safety of the building, stepped forward, her heart pounding. She approached Jack cautiously, her eyes wide. "Jack." He turned to her, his expression softening immediately. "You okay?" She nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "You didn't have to do all this." "Yes, I did," he said, pulling her into a hug. "No one messes with you. Not on my watch." The bikers were gone, but the story didn't end there. Over the next few days, word of Jack's actions spread across the campus and beyond. Students approached Claire with newfound respect, some even apologizing for not stepping in sooner. Faculty members nodded approvingly, grateful for the quiet strength she and Jack represented. The campus parking lot, once a symbol of intimidation, became a place of safety again. The bikers never returned, and for the first time in days, Claire felt at ease. But it wasn't just about the bikers. Claire realized something deeper about her husband in those moments. The strength he carried wasn't just physical. It was the strength to protect, to stand up for what was right, and to show that even the quietest battles could be won with the loudest actions. As the weeks went on, Claire's car remained parked in its usual spot, a visible reminder of what had happened. But now, it bore no new scratches, no signs of vandalism. It was untouched, respected, a testament to the message Jack had sent loud and clear. And while life on campus returned to normal, one thing was certain: no one would ever underestimate Claire Hammond or her husband again. As Jack told her later that night, his voice warm with affection, sometimes, the best way to teach people a lesson is to show them what they're up against. To Claire, it was more than a lesson, it was love in action. As the days passed, the echoes of Jack's confrontation rippled across the town. People who had only heard fragments of the story whispered about the retired Marine who had stood against a gang and sent them packing. Claire, ever humble, brushed off the attention, but Jack could see how it lifted her spirits. At the college, a new atmosphere had settled. Students who had previously taken Claire's calm demeanor for granted now greeted her with respect. Some even sought her advice, inspired by her quiet strength. For Claire, it was a reminder that being underestimated often carried its own kind of power. But for Jack, it wasn't over. He knew men like Vince didn't just disappear, they regrouped, strategized, and returned, often angrier than before. It wasn't paranoia, it was experience. And Jack, with his lifetime of preparation, was ready for the storm he suspected was coming. It started subtly, almost too quietly. Jack began noticing things around their neighborhood. A motorcycle parked a little too long at the corner. The same black van driving by their house at odd hours. To an untrained eye, it was nothing. But to Jack, it was a pattern. One evening, as he and Claire sat on their porch watching the sunset, Jack broached the subject. "Claire," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "I think they're still lurking." Claire's brow furrowed, her earlier calm replaced with worry. "But they're gone. Everyone saw them leave." Jack leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "They left, yes. But men like Vince don't just back down. They're probably watching, trying to figure out their next move." Claire's hand found his. "What should we do?" Jack squeezed her hand reassuringly. "We stay prepared. They won't catch us off guard." Jack's preparation began immediately. He revisited old contacts, tapping into a network of Marines and law enforcement buddies who owed him a favor or two. He set up subtle defenses around their home, motion-activated cameras, reinforced locks, and even a few surprises that only someone with his background would think to implement. At the same time, Jack worked on the social front. He strengthened ties with the college community, speaking with the dean and security staff about what had happened. The parking lot now had regular patrols, and Claire's car was given a prime, highly visible parking spot right near the main entrance. Through it all, Jack maintained his calm demeanor, never letting the tension show in front of Claire. But inside, he was a coiled spring, ready to act if the need arose. The confrontation came on a stormy Friday night. Rain lashed against the windows as thunder rumbled in the distance. Claire was grading papers in the study, while Jack sat in the living room, a book in his hands but his attention elsewhere. It started with a sound, a faint, low rumble that could barely be heard over the storm. But Jack's ears, trained by years of combat, caught it immediately. He stood, setting the book aside, and moved to the window. The sight confirmed his suspicions. Headlights cut through the rain as a line of motorcycles approached their house, their engines drowned out by the storm. "Claire," Jack called, his voice calm but urgent. She appeared in the doorway, her face pale. "Is it them?" Jack nodded. "Stay inside. Lock the doors. Don't come out until I say it's safe." "But Jack." "Trust me," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. By the time the bikers parked outside, Jack was already waiting for them on the porch. He stood tall, his arms crossed over his chest, as the group dismounted and approached. Vince was at the forefront, a scowl etched across his face. The rain slicked back his hair, making him look more feral than ever. "We're not done, old man," Vince growled, stopping at the foot of the steps. "You think you can embarrass me in front of my crew and get away with it?" Jack didn't flinch. "You embarrassed yourself, Vince. You came after my wife, and you paid the price. Walk away now, and I'll forget you even showed up tonight." Vince's laugh was bitter. "You think I'm afraid of you? You don't know who you're dealing with." Jack stepped forward, his boots echoing on the wooden porch. "And you don't know who I'm dealing with." The sound of approaching engines filled the air. From the shadows, another line of motorcycles emerged. Jack's Marine buddies, who had been stationed nearby in anticipation of this very moment. They dismounted with practiced ease, their presence a stark contrast to the bikers' unruly appearance. Vince's men shifted uncomfortably, their earlier confidence evaporating. They hadn't expected this. Jack's voice cut through the tension like a knife. "You had your chance, Vince. Now, we finish this." The standoff was intense. Vince tried to rally his men, but it was clear they were outmatched. Jack and his team moved with precision, their training evident in every step. The bikers, for all their bluster, couldn't compete with the discipline and resolve of the Marines. When it was over, Vince and his crew were left defeated, their bikes impounded, and their pride in tatters. Law enforcement, already alerted by Jack's contacts, arrived to take the gang into custody. As Vince was hauled away, he glared at Jack. "You think you've won? This isn't over." Jack's response was calm but final. "It is for you." Back inside, Claire wrapped her arms around Jack, her relief palpable. "I don't know how you do it," she whispered. Jack smiled, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "You don't mess with what matters most to me." The rain continued to fall, washing away the remnants of the night's chaos. For the Hammonds, peace had been hard-won, but it was a peace they knew would last. Because when it came to protecting his own, Jack Hammond never failed. The night after the bikers had been taken away, the storm had finally passed, and the campus was quiet again. The loud roar of engines and the chaos of that confrontation felt like a distant memory. But things had changed, not just for Claire and Jack, but for everyone around them. What had seemed like a small incident had left a deep impact. Jack had dealt with the immediate threat, but that wasn't the end of it. He wasn't the type to leave loose ends. He knew that, in a world of rules and consequences, even the smallest act of rebellion could set a dangerous precedent. And when people stepped out of line, they had to learn the hard way that there were repercussions. So, after the bikers were carted off to jail and taken to the police station, Jack made sure they wouldn't have an easy out. Claire's car, which had been marred by the gang's cruel taunting and vandalism, was already being repaired. The insurance would cover most of it, but Jack wasn't satisfied with that. He contacted the local authorities to ensure that the gang had to pay for the damage themselves. It wasn't just the car that needed repairing. Claire's sense of safety had been shattered, her once calm and predictable life disturbed. The bikers' reckless behavior had crossed a line, and now it was time to make them face the consequences. They had made the mistake of assuming Claire was an easy target. What they hadn't accounted for was the fact that Claire's life had always been a little more complicated than they realized. With Jack by her side, she wasn't just a quiet professor anymore, she was someone with the full force of his strength behind her. The campus security, who had been caught off guard by the whole incident, now moved quickly to put up measures to prevent it from happening again. They installed more cameras around the faculty parking lot and increased patrols around the campus. It wasn't just about protecting the property anymore, it was about making sure students and staff felt safe on their own turf. Claire's department also noticed a change. Her colleagues, who had always respected her professional capabilities, now looked at her with a little more admiration. There was something unspoken in their gaze, a newfound respect for the quiet woman who had somehow survived a dangerous encounter without batting an eye. But the real shift came from the students. Claire had always been a popular professor, known for her calm demeanor and encouraging words. Yet, after the bikers had come and gone, a subtle change occurred. Students didn't just listen to her, they looked to her for guidance, their eyes a little more attentive, their expressions a little more curious. And it wasn't because of her lecture on the history of literature or the classics she taught with such passion. It was because they'd seen her withstand something unexpected, something that required not just intelligence but strength, a strength they hadn't realized she possessed. One by one, students approached her after class with kind words. "I'm glad you're okay, Professor Hammond. I heard what happened. You were amazing." They no longer saw her as just the quiet professor who showed up every day with a smile. They saw someone who had been pushed too far and had fought back with a force they never expected. As for Jack, he continued his peaceful life, content with the knowledge that he had done what was necessary. His role in the events was quietly celebrated by the few who knew the full story. To most of the world, he was just another retired Marine, quietly living out his days with his wife. But to Claire and those who knew him, Jack's actions were more than just physical strength, they were an expression of unwavering love and protection. Jack never wanted attention, never sought out praise. He was just doing what any husband would do for his wife. He was content knowing that, when push came to shove, he had been there to protect her. Days passed, and the dust began to settle. The bikers, having spent a night in jail and been forced to face the consequences of their actions, were eventually released. But it wasn't a simple matter of them walking away unscathed. The local authorities had been quick to respond, ensuring that the gang faced fines and had to cover the damages done to Claire's car. More than that, they were now on record, their criminal behavior linked to a series of incidents that had finally caught up with them. Their bikes, once gleaming symbols of power and fear, were impounded. Their reckless disregard for others had cost them far more than they had anticipated. But the gang's punishment didn't end there. They were banned from entering the campus, their names and faces plastered on security posters throughout the area. They had become pariahs, known for their violent tendencies and their bullying ways. Word spread quickly. The bikers were no longer feared, they were mocked, their reputation damaged by their own foolish actions. Despite the gang's public downfall, Jack didn't gloat. He knew that the justice had been served, and that was enough. He didn't need anyone to thank him or praise him for standing up to bullies. He had done what he needed to do, and the world was returning to normal. For Claire, the impact was lasting. She had always been a woman of quiet strength, but now, she carried herself with a newfound confidence. She knew she was capable of handling the unexpected, no matter what it looked like. In the end, the most important thing had been the bond between her and Jack. Their marriage wasn't just built on love, it was built on mutual respect, trust, and the knowledge that, no matter what, they had each other's backs. They didn't need to say it out loud, they showed it through actions. Jack had shown his dedication through his fierce protection of her. Claire had shown her resilience by holding her ground, even when the odds seemed stacked against her. The bikers were gone, their names forgotten by most, but the lessons learned from that confrontation remained etched in the minds of those who had witnessed it. The quiet professor with the soft voice and the retired Marine who kept his cool under pressure had proven that strength came in many forms. Sometimes, it was loud and brash. But other times, it was quiet and deliberate. And Claire and Jack Hammond, though they might have been underestimated, would never be forgotten. Their story became a quiet legend, one of love, strength, and the unbreakable bond between them. And for those who had learned to respect that bond, it served as a reminder that sometimes, the best way to show power was through humility and integrity. In the end, justice had been served, not just through the consequences faced by the bikers, but through the change in how everyone now saw Claire and Jack. They were no longer just the professor and her quiet husband. They were a force to be reckoned with. Sometimes, strength comes in unexpected forms. People often think that strength must be loud and obvious, something you can see from a distance. But the truth is, strength can be quiet, steady, and enduring. It doesn't always shout from the rooftops. Sometimes, it hides behind a calm smile or in the way someone moves through the world, undeterred by obstacles. For Claire and Jack Hammond, their strength wasn't about being the loudest or the toughest person in the room. It wasn't about making a grand statement. Their strength was in the way they stood together, the way they silently supported each other, and the way they faced life's challenges without ever needing to make a scene. Claire had always been the quiet professor. She was soft-spoken but deeply knowledgeable. She didn't demand attention, and she didn't try to impress anyone with flashy words or gestures. She let her work speak for itself. But when her peace was disrupted, when something important to her was threatened, she didn't back down. She faced the situation head-on, with grace, but also with quiet strength. Her ability to endure and persevere was her true power. And then there was Jack. A retired Marine. A man with a past most people couldn't even begin to imagine. Jack had spent years in situations that demanded everything from him. He had been tested in ways that many people couldn't understand. But now, he lived a quiet life. He didn't go looking for trouble. He didn't want to prove himself to anyone. He didn't need to. He had already done that. His strength came from the peace he had earned after years of battle, but it also came from knowing when to act, when to protect, and when to stand by the person he loved. When the bikers came into their lives, expecting to intimidate and destroy, they never expected the quiet professor and her Marine husband to stand against them. They assumed that the quiet ones were easy targets, that they could get away with their cruelty without any real consequences. But they were wrong. And the bikers learned that lesson the hard way. The story of Claire and Jack was one of those rare reminders that appearances can be deceiving. How often do we judge someone based on how they look or how they act on the surface? How many times do we underestimate the person who doesn't shout the loudest, or the one who keeps to themselves? We live in a world where strength is often measured by how loud you can be or how much you can show off. But true strength is in the quiet moments. It's in the way you hold your ground when everything around you is chaotic. It's in knowing when to speak, and when to act, even when no one is watching. It's in the ability to rise above the noise and do what's right, even when it's hard. Claire and Jack had something that the bikers could never understand. They had an unshakable bond, built over years of mutual respect, love, and trust. They didn't need to make a big scene to show their power. They knew the value of patience, the strength of standing firm, and the importance of having each other's backs, no matter what. For the students who had watched the confrontation unfold, the lesson was clear. The loudest person in the room wasn't always the strongest. Sometimes, it was the person who seemed the quietest, the most unassuming, who had the greatest power. They learned that you shouldn't judge someone based on their appearance or how much attention they draw. The most powerful people are often the ones who stay calm and composed, even in the face of adversity. And for the bikers, it was a lesson they would never forget. They had underestimated Claire and Jack. They had assumed that because Claire was a quiet professor, she wouldn't fight back. They had assumed that because Jack was a retired Marine, he was no longer capable of handling himself in a tough situation. But they were wrong. And that mistake had cost them far more than they had ever imagined. Underestimating the quiet ones can lead to loud consequences. The bikers learned that lesson the hard way, and in doing so, they paid the price for their arrogance. But the true consequence wasn't just their bruised egos or their damaged reputation, it was the fact that they had underestimated the strength of a woman and the power of a man who had quietly dedicated his life to protecting the ones he loved. This story isn't just about Claire and Jack. It's about everyone who has ever been underestimated, overlooked, or told they were too quiet, too ordinary, or too weak to stand up for themselves. It's about those who might not seem like much on the surface, but who carry within them a strength that no one can take away. In a world that often rewards loudness and aggression, it's important to remember that strength doesn't always look the way we expect it to. Sometimes, it's in the way someone quietly navigates through life. Sometimes, it's in the way someone responds to adversity with calm determination. And sometimes, it's in the way two people stand together, side by side, facing the world and whatever comes their way. Claire and Jack didn't need to prove anything to anyone. They had already shown the world that true strength isn't about how loudly you roar, but how firmly you stand when everything around you is trying to push you down. The next time someone tells you that you're too quiet, too small, or too meek, remember Claire and Jack. Remember that the loudest roar isn't always the one that shakes the earth. Sometimes, the quietest voices are the ones that carry the most power. In the end, strength is about more than just physical power. It's about resilience. It's about knowing who you are and standing firm in the face of whatever life throws at you. And it's about knowing that, when the time comes, you'll be ready not to fight the loudest battle, but to win the fight that matters the most. And for Claire and Jack, that fight wasn't just about protecting themselves. It was about standing up for what was right. It was about showing the world that sometimes the quietest ones are the ones you should never underestimate. Because when push comes to shove, they might just surprise you with a strength you never saw coming.